The top story at this hour. Cash-strapped Pakistan's economy is in doldrums, and data from the country's economic survey a day before the country's budget proves that fact. In fact, the economy failed to achieve any of the targets it set out in 2022-2023 for that year. Pakistan's GDP growth rate crashed to 0.3% in 2022-23 as political instability and natural disaster dragged the country. The country had set 5% growth target for the year. The report added that flood damages and rehabilitation will cost the Pakistan GDP $14.9 billion and $16.3 billion respectively. The country's per capita income stood at $1,568 in 2022-23 compared to $1,765 in 2021-22. That's largely due to a weaker Pakistani rupee, lower GDP growth and rising population. Inflation, a major headache for the average Pakistani, continued to be very high in 2022-23. The urban and rural core inflation in that fiscal year stood at 16% and 20.1% respectively. This was way more than the 7.8% urban and 8.6% rural inflation recorded in the previous fiscal 2021-22. Pakistan's Finance Minister Ishaq Dar blamed the Imran Khan government for the ballooning current account deficit, which shows that imports are more in value than exports. The fiscal deficit, he said, stood at 5.8% in 2018, but reached 7.9% by 2022 when the Shehbaz Sharif government took over. A rising current account deficit is an indication that the country is unable to pay its import bills. Now, for more on this, we are being joined by Syed Javed Hassan, an economic columnist and former chairman of the Economic Advisory Group. He is joining us from London. Welcome to the broadcast, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Sir, what do you think the budget will be today? Because, you know, on the one side, there are populist schemes because there are elections that are coming. It's likely to be a populist budget. And on the other, Pakistan has the opportunity to show the world and the IMF that this budget is one step towards long-term structural reforms by giving out a fiscal prudence policy. So how do you think the government is going to balance this, populism versus fiscal prudence?
I think Pakistan doesn't have any options but to adopt fiscal prudence right now. Really, more than anything else, it needs to revive the IMF program, which is the 9th review has been stalled for the last 6 months. If it doesn't do so, we will go out of the program, which ends at the end of this month in June, and without completing it. And that would be quite disastrous because effectively it would suggest that Pakistan has a very likelihood of default. Having said all that, as you have pointed out, there's an election coming up this year, and the government will want to provide a budget that is pro-people, so to speak. Now, I feel that there is a likelihood that the government will err on the side of populism rather than prudence. And there we have a real danger. And from what we have heard, the public sector spending proposals are something in the tune of 1 trillion. Now, that's something that will certainly not please IMF. The total revenue collection that is targeted is something like 9.2 trillion. From my understanding, IMF is looking for a much higher figure in terms of revenue generation. So it remains to be seen how Pakistan and the government meets the IMF conditionality that whatever budget there is, it should be in line with the objectives of the EFF program that it currently is in. I am fearful that the present government will err on the side of populism rather than prudence.
Sir, let's also talk about tax collections. That has increased in the last fiscal, but most of it seems to be going for debt repayment. So, do you think the government will have a plan to put the tax money for public good rather than divert it for debt repayment? Is there room for doing that?
There isn't any room, given that the interest rates have jumped up quite dramatically in the current year by something like 8%. It's currently interest borrowing costs for the government are around 21%, and that's likely to go up further if it is to meet IMF demands. So the spending in terms of just interest payments is something to the tune of 7 trillion. And as I've mentioned, the total government revenue is 9.2 trillion. So once you have the provincial allocations from the overall revenue, there's very little to spend in terms of federal deficit, in terms of federal spending. Nevertheless, I think they do plan to have a budgetary spend for development, and that will all be from borrowed money. It remains to be seen how will they finance this spending, given that unless we are back in the IMF program, we will not have any funding either from IMF, World Bank, multilateral agencies. And we have to remember the credit markets right now are closed. International credit markets are closed to Pakistan effectively, with the bond rates trading at something, yields are trading at something like 100%. It's highly unlikely that Pakistan will be able to raise money through international markets. So it really is a conundrum, which I really fail to understand how the government plans to have these budgetary spend programs.
Right, so we'll talk about foreign investment in just a bit, but talking about the current account deficit, the government seems to be blaming the previous regime, which was the Imran Khan government. What are the options in front of the government, to narrow the current account deficit?
In the short term, very few. And moreover, if it does try to narrow it by putting import restrictions, that has a severe impact in terms of the overall economy. And that's what the government has tried to do. It's tried to basically stop imports by administrative measures, even though it claims there are no such administrative measures. Now, effectively, what it has done is a lot of the industries which are import dependent, they have had to suffer, and suffered quite considerably. In the last month, the large-scale manufacturing has fallen by 25% for the month, year on year. Overall, large-scale manufacturing has fallen by 8% year on year for the year. And that's largely driven by the import restrictions that have been placed. So if they place any further import restrictions to balance the payments, to have a BOP in surplus, frankly speaking, the economy will tank even further. And already unsubstantiated or undocumented reports suggest unemployment is close to 11%. If there's further contraction in the economy, you could see this unemployment skyrocket.
Also, sir, let's talk about the food inflation. Now, Pakistan's food inflation, both rural and urban areas, reached 48.1% recently, the highest since the financial year 2016. What are the government steps here to reduce that food inflation? Because that's really pinching the common person.
It's not only since 2016, it's probably highest in the last 40 years. We have never seen these kind of inflationary figures in Pakistan in the recent past. Now, really, there is very little the government can do. Again, it is trying to do administrative measures. Those administrative measures tend to be very ineffective. The best way to actually allow inflation to come down is to allow importation of foods, products from either Iran, India, or other countries, so that we don't tend to have these kind of inflationary pressures. But one of the reasons why there is this is the continuous depreciation of rupee. Now, again, how do you do that? One of the ways to do it is by raising interest rates. If you do that, that has an effect on output. So I'm afraid I don't have much positive news to say that all the options that the government has are very bad ones. Now, it needs, first and foremost, it needs to get back into the IMF program, release the sort of 2.3 billion that IMF needs to give. That will open up money from World Bank, and it will also ease pressure on the currency. That will help in terms of easing inflationary pressures. So
Yes.
I really fail to see why government should pursue any other avenue rather than trying to make sure that we get back into the IMF program.
We're running short on time, but I want to quickly squeeze in one last question on the foreign investment front, sir. You know, forex reserves are at a low for some time now. Will we see any scheme in the budget to attract foreign investment?
There is talk of encouraging overseas Pakistanis to bring in money back to Pakistan or bring in money to Pakistan by giving tax concessions, to removing any disclosure laws. I don't know if that will meet the requirements of IMF and generally also FATF. So there are question marks about this. There are schemes being planned, but really where your international credit rating is so poor as being rated near junk, it's very difficult to see how Pakistan can at present encourage too much foreign direct investment.
All right, Syed Javed Hassan, thanks very much for joining us with your perspective. Always great to have you on the program, sir.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll wait and see how the budget is unveiled in Parliament, what all the schemes that the government announces there. There are multiple challenges that the economy is facing. It is in doldrums, to say the least. The data from the country's economic survey says so. The country has missed all their economic targets. Virtually every economic target it has failed to achieve for the year 2022-23. The GDP is down, crashing to 0.3% in that fiscal year. The country had in fact set a target of 5% growth target. All they managed to achieve was 0.3% in the year 2022-23. The country's per capita income has also fallen to $1,568 compared to $1,765 in the previous fiscal. That's largely due to a weaker Pakistani rupee, lower GDP and rising population. Now, Syed Javed Hassan is saying that the government may err on the side of populism than prudence, but what this country needs, according to him, at the moment is fiscal prudence. Let's go across to Anas Malik, our Pakistan Bureau Chief, joining us right now from Islamabad. Anas, you know, the GDP growth has missed the target by a mile now. On practically all indicators, the government has failed to achieve its target. What are the expectations from the budget today?
Well, we're looking at a budget that might be people-friendly, but at the same time adhering to IMF demands. It's a tightrope to walk on for the government because this is an election year. We're looking at the assemblies to be resolved in about 2 months' time. On the 12th of August is when the electoral term is completed of this assembly. So they have to walk a tightrope. There's a 6 billion financing deficit or a return deficit in case if the IMF steps in. Therefore, it is imperative for the Pakistani authorities to fill up that gap, and that gap can only be filled up in case if the IMF steps in. So they would have to abide or give this semblance of abidance to the IMF conditions, and we would be looking at lesser subsidies or more taxation and targeted subsidies, especially in the agriculture sector. A slight raise in the defense sector or in the defense budget as it is expected, a slight raise in the pensions of former government employees, and a slight raise in the salary of former government employees of current government employees. We would also be expecting a raise in the tax net, largely speaking. We would also be expecting a raise in the tax net for the non-filers, especially with regards to property transactions and banking transactions. In a short while from now, Rohit, we would be seeing the Pakistani Finance Minister Ishaq Dar presenting the budget. The budget session is supposed to get underway at 4 p.m. Pakistan time, and before that at about 3 p.m. inside the parliament after the Friday prayers, we would be seeing that the cabinet meeting will be held where the budget approval will be given by the cabinet. Rohit?
Anas, briefly, let's also talk about how this budget is being viewed politically. You know, on the current account deficit, the government, Ishaq Dar, in fact, the minister has blamed the Imran Khan government. So how closely is the opposition watching this budget?
Practically, there is no opposition. Because whatever opposition we have was essentially former PTI and had then decided to jump ship or be turncoats. So practically we would not be seeing any such opposition, though the speech by the current leader of the opposition, Raja Riaz, that would be on Monday, that would be very interesting and that would be very closely watched out. But that being said, you've rightly mentioned Ishaq Dar pinning the blame on Imran Khan and external factors in his economic survey presser, and said that it is because of those external factors that they have not been able to control or get the economic situation in control. So as I said, it would be really interesting as to which side the government opts to, whether it continues to walk the tightrope that it is on and does a classical balancing act, or whether it goes into the IMF camp. That means it would not be a people friendly budget, it would not be an election friendly budget, or in third case scenario, it completely goes off track from the IMF program, not abides by their demands and gives a people friendly budget, because as I said, it is an election year. And in fact, what sources have also told me that in this upcoming budget that is to be presented today at about 4:30 p.m. Pakistan time, the government has allocated a good chunk of money for the elections as well, that will be handed over to the Election Commission of Pakistan. Rohit.
All right, Anas, thanks very much for joining us with those details. The question is, what sort of a balance will the government have between fiscal prudence and populism? That's the key thing to watch out for. Thanks, Anas, for joining us with those details. We'll wait and see in just a few hours from now how the budget is unveiled in Parliament, what the budget holds for the people of Pakistan.
तो वो कायद का पाकिस्तान, कल यहाँ पर चीफ जस्टिस ऑफ पाकिस्तान ने कहा इमरान खान साहब आपको मिलकर बहुत खुशी हो रही है, और ऐसे मुकदमे में आपको हर चीज का इल्म है। जब मोहतरमा बेनजीर